Good morning, friends. In our Lord's teaching on being willing to give up our rights, he said, if anyone forces you to go to 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. And you'll remember that this was a specific scenario that did happen in first century Israel because as a Roman occupied territory, the Roman soldiers could press the local citizenry into service at basically any given moment. They could compel people to carry loads for them up to a Roman mile, which was 1,000 paces. But then a Jewish person had the right to stop immediately at that point. And yet Jesus says, if you're pressed into service, don't count your paces and stop as soon as you have the right to. Go double the expected distance. And even then, I think this is just like when Peter asked Jesus how many times he had to forgive people, and Jesus said not 7 times, but 7 times 7, which of course is a fairly simple math to do, which is 49. But the point isn't that you stop forgiving on the 50th time. The point isn't that you, in the same way, the point isn't that you now count paces to 2,000 and then you refuse to go any further. It's about a heart attitude that is willing to set aside one's own rights in order to love another person in a self-sacrificing manner, even as Christ did for us. And I want to tell you a story from my own life experience of this principle being put into action, but believe me, yours truly is not the hero of the story. Because when I worked at UPS, I was a supervisor and we were part-time salary, which meant generally we didn't work more than 30 hours a week. But during peak season, leading up to Christmas time, well, you guessed it, our hours soared each week, and that was fine and all. But then one year, the higher ups did what they'd never done before. They mandated that supervisors had to work on Christmas Eve. Well, many of us, myself very much included, did not appreciate that. It had never happened before. Christmas Eve was like, we didn't have to work, but this year we did. And that was not acceptable to many of us, again, myself included, because we were part time employees. And so that was our rationale. Anyway, we were given a choice. We had to work a shift on Christmas Eve, and we could do it in one of two ways. We could arrive at the hub at 2 o'clock in the morning and work the preload shift, the one that loads the package cars to go out, or we could show up about 9 o'clock in the morning and go out in the package cars and help the drivers deliver the actual packages. Well, despite the early hour, I chose the 2 a.m. shift, and I chose it for one reason and basically one reason only. Despite having to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve, I knew that if I worked that early morning shift, then when the belt stopped moving at 8 a.m. for the full-timers to go on lunch, then I could leave and no one could stop me. And if anybody tried to, I could say, man, I've been here since 2 o'clock this morning. I'm a part-timer. It's 8 in the morning on Christmas Eve, and I've already put in 6 hours of work. You can't stop me from leaving. So by doing it that way, I could control when I got to be finished. I could control when I got to be done. And so that was my tactic, and I followed through on it. And I was back home in bed by 8:30 in the morning, Christmas Eve morning. I slept until about noon, then got up and had the rest of Christmas Eve with my family. But there was this other guy who was also a supervisor. His name was Dan, and Dan was a Christian as well. And for whatever reason, perhaps because he was somewhat new and he'd never been through a peak season before, and so maybe he didn't know how things worked, but Dan arrived at the 9 o'clock start time, and he ended up going out in one of the package cars to deliver packages. Friends, I found out afterward that he was out delivering packages until roughly 10 o'clock that night, Christmas Eve night. And what's more, at about 6 in the evening, 6 p.m., the actual package car driver whom he was helping turned to him and thanked him for how much he'd helped him throughout the day and gave Dan his blessing to be done, to call it a day, because he had to go back to the hub and get more packages. And so Dan had the opportunity to cut out and go home. But Dan said no, he'd see things through. And so even though he had the chance, with the driver's blessing no less, to be done, he stayed for the sake of that driver to help him, even though it meant he wasn't going to get home until really late Christmas Eve. Now, friends, on that Christmas Eve, those however many years ago, who was it that was living out the principles and the attitude that we see Jesus commanding here of his people in Matthew 5? Because it wasn't me. I went and did my duty and not an ounce more. But Dan, he was pressed in the service just the same as I was, but he wasn't counting paces like I was. He wasn't looking for the soonest opportunity to cut and run like I was, to do what I wanted to do. How dare you take my Christmas Eve away from me and my family. And even when he had the opportunity to legitimately be done, his thought was, man, I'd love to be home with my family, but what about the driver? He's got a family too. I'm sure he'd like to be home just the same as I would. And so he stayed, and he loved that driver enough to bear the burden of that task at the very end. That's what Jesus is calling us to. And obviously, I haven't forgotten that scenario because it both put me to shame and it instructed me on how not to be, and as well as how to be in the future. Be willing to love for the sake of others in a self-sacrificing way, because, and this is the real point of the point of self-sacrificing in this way. The guys that I was working with, that I was helping out, they knew how anxious I was to leave. I was entirely focused on myself during that time. But that driver who gave Dan his blessing to be done, but Dan said, nah, I'm with you until you're done too. Well, which Christian, Dan or myself, would have had a stronger witness of the gospel with the people they were working with in the situation? And that's what it's all about, because the people that I was working with would have every right to call me a hypocrite. You know, all you've been thinking about is yourself, but now that the gospel came up, now you're concerned about us. But Dan had a good foundation of love, of self-sacrificing love, that driver would know. If he shared the gospel with him, he's sharing it with me because he cares about me. You know, we must be willing to let go of our own rights, let go of our demands, let go of even our legitimate expectations, so we can love people who don't deserve it, even as Christ loved us, because we certainly didn't deserve it either. So let's keep this in mind. It's a lesson I've learned from, and I want to continue to put in practice, and I hope we each do. With that in mind, have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I'll see you soon.